Good morning, Year 5, and happy Monday. I hope you all had a lovely weekend. So we're going to be carrying on looking at fractions this week, and today we're going to be recapping adding and subtracting fractions. And I know you looked at this last week with Miss Cheel, but we thought it'd be a good idea if we had another lesson just to consolidate our understanding on adding and subtracting fractions when the denominator is different. Right, so let's have a go at this question on the board. We're doing 1/4 add 1/2. So first thing we've got to do is we've got to make it easier for ourselves. We've got to find a common denominator. Okay, and we can do that by writing out the times tables below each of the denominators. So 2, 4, 6, 8. Okay, and then we're going to now write out the times tables for the denominator 1/4. 4, 8, 12. You can then compare both sets of times tables and find the common denominator, which is 4. Well done. So now what we've got to do is we've got to change 1/2 into quarters. How many halves make how many quarters? Okay, so first of all, we've got to have a look. What do you do to 2 to get to 4? Okay, that's right, you multiply it by 2. So then remember our rule, whatever you do to the bottom, you've got to do to the top. So if we've times the bottom by 2, we've then got to times the top number by 2, which then gives us 2/4. So we know that 1/2 is equivalent to 2/4. We don't need to do anything to this because it's already in quarters. So we can ignore that and now look simply at 2/4 add 1/4 equals 3/4. That was quite an easy one because we didn't have to do anything to this number. Okay, so we're going to go through another example. This time we're going to be doing a takeaway to find the answer. So now we're going to have a look at 3/4 take away 2/5. So first thing we need to do is make it easy for ourselves. So we're going to find a common denominator. So I'm going to write out the times tables for the 4 times tables and the 5 times tables. So 4, 8, 12, 16 and 20. 5, 10, 15, 20. So can you spot the common denominator? Absolutely, it's 20. And some of you might be so good at your times tables, you won't need to write them out. But if you still find your times tables a little bit tricky, write them out like I've done below. And then you can very easily see what the common denominator will be. So now we've got to turn 3/4 into 20ths. So what do you do to 4 to get to 20? And we can see here, we multiply it by 5. So we multiply it by 5, and that gives us 20. Then we've got to do the same to the top. So 3 times by 5, which gives us 15. So we've got 15 20ths. So we don't need to look at that anymore because we have made the equivalent fraction of 15 20ths. So now moving on to have a look at 2/5. So we've got to turn it into 20ths because that was our common denominator. What do you do to 5 to get to 20? You multiply it by 4. And then the same to the top, multiply 2 by 4, and you get 8. And as we don't need that 2/5 anymore, we can clearly see that we're doing 15 20ths, take away 8 20ths, which gives us 7 20ths. And you can have a little look at that number and see, can I reduce that any further? Is there a number that goes into 7 and 20 and leaves no remainders? No, there's not. So this fraction here is the fraction in its simplest form. So we're going to have a look at reducing a fraction on the next page. I've heard me say now make sure you reduce the fraction to its simplest form. So after you've added or subtracted, you've got to make sure the fraction is in its simplest form. So let's have a look at this fraction here. So first we're going to find a common denominator. We can clearly see that the common denominator here is 10. Okay, so this one obviously stays as 2/10. This one we have to change a little bit. So to get from 5 to 10, we multiplied it by 2. We've got to do the same to the top. So 1 times by 2 is 2. And then we simply add the numerators, which gives us 4/10. So now we've got to look at 4/10 and think to ourselves, is this fraction in its simplest form? So 4/10. Can we make this fraction appear smaller? Is there a number that goes into 4 and into 10? So hopefully you're able to see that both 4 and 10 are divisible by 2, because we looked at this maybe a week ago. So we're going to do 4 divided by 2, which gives us 2. And then we're going to do 10 divided by 2, again, because whatever we do to the top, we've got to do to the bottom. 10 divided by 2, which gives us 5. So we know 1/5 add 2/10 equals 2/5. That's the fraction at its lowest, in its simplest form, 2/5. So things to remember: find the common denominator, add or subtract your numerators, and then reduce the fraction to its simplest form. And this usually involves dividing the number, finding a number that will go into both your numerator and denominator. If you can't find a number that will go into both your numerator and your denominator, then your fraction is already at its simplest form. Right, so your work for today. First thing you're going to do is you're going to be adding these fractions. Okay, so you're finding a common denominator, then adding the fractions. I do want you to have a go at writing the fraction in its simplest form. So after you've added them together, you then need to find out what the fraction is in its simplest form. Okay, so if you are struggling with that, make sure you go back to the previous slide and have a look at how to do that. You're then going to be doing some subtraction questions. Again, I would like you to write your answer in the simplest form. Okay, so find a common denominator, then subtract the numerators, okay, after you've found a common denominator, and then write your answer in the simplest form. Okay, and finally, your challenge, you've got a word problem, and it says Olivia went out for a walk. She walked 3/4 of a mile and then sat down to take a rest. Then she walked 1/8 of a mile. How far did she walk altogether? So altogether, think about what that is telling us to do. Is it telling us to subtract 1/8 from 3/4, or is it telling us to add 1/8 to 3/4? And then write out your sum, 3/4 add 1/8, or 3/4 subtract 1/8, whatever you decide to do. And then your clue, find a common denominator. Okay? So good luck with your work. You don't need to be posting your work onto Dojo, but if you are getting stuck on any part of this, please do message Miss Cheel or myself, and then we will re-go over it either next week or at some point during this week.